And welcome this afternoon to the PQM Endorsement and Maintenance Guidebook. My name is Quintella Bester. I am the Senior Program Manager here at Patel for this contract. And we will be going through some enhancements to our guidebook. We can go to the next slide. And this is our E&M leadership team. Today you will hear from Matt Pickering, our E&M task lead, as well as Anna Mickey, our E&M deputy task lead, around the enhancements that we have for our latest guidebook. Next slide. So today what we're hoping to cover is to review the enhancements to the Endorsement and Maintenance Guidebook and review public comments that we received, as well as our engagement opportunities. As always, we're looking and adding opportunities for all of our stakeholders and interested parties to engage with us. We will have questions at the end and open discussion, so we will always leave time for that. We can move to the next slide. All right, enhancements to the E&M guidebook processes and policies. So we talk about in this our enhanced guidebook, the changes to the committee size, the names. As some of you may remember, under the previous CBE, there were 14 committees. There are now projects, there are now 5. We talk about how we convene, our new voting structure, as well as our updates to public commenting opportunities, some of the requirements for measures to be endorsed, and how those endorsements are processed or realized, especially if there are some considerations around endorsements. And then there's this change to the PQM measure evaluation rubric that we will discuss. We'll also talk about endorsement with conditions and what those conditions look like and how those will be designated. Clarity around the appeals process and what the appeals process must include, and then clarity on maintenance endorsements, and then they're updating the policies for deferrals. Next slide. All right, this is an overview of the comments that we received. Our public commenting period was from June 4th to June 24th. We received comments from 5 organizations and 1 individual, and you'll see the list of the organizations there. And the comments were focused on various aspects of the guidebook. And as you can see in this table, it gives you an understanding of the number of comments and the categories. So general versus public commenting, E&M policies, the endorsed with condition designation, and so on and so forth. So this just gives you an idea of the areas that the comments were received on. Next slide. All right, so now I'm going to hand it over to Matthew Pickering, who's the lead for endorsement and maintenance. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Quinn. And again, welcome everyone to attending this webinar. As Quinn mentioned, it is here to present the changes that we've had put into the E&M guidebook, which is some changes to our processes and policies. Some of these changes actually took effect in spring 2024, which is the cycle we're currently going through right now. The changes that did take effect were largely around committee structure and engagement. So we will be drawing attention to that today as just a reminder of what those changes were, and also some of our responses, some of the comments that we received on those changes, even though they are in effect. We did have a public comment opportunity prior to when those changes did take effect for the spring 2024 cycle, but we still received some comments on those changes as they were outlined in the guidebook, which we'll recognize and talk to. We also received additional comments on some of the other changes that were not part of the spring 2024 cycle enhancements. Those around the rubric, as well as some updates to our maintenance policies, deferments, things of that nature that, again, we'll be going through today. So as you saw that table, the comments really aligned with all of the changes that we had made within that guidebook, and we'll be touching on those comments and also summarizing our responses as well today. So going to the next slide, just talks about some of the general comments that we received. So back in that table 1, we received from those commenters, there were 4 comments that really were general, meaning they didn't really apply to any specific area of the guidance or process. It was really just sort of overarching or overall. And one of those was that the E&M Guidebook is well put together and is an excellent tool for endorsement. Another that's listed here is that comments about transparency, engagement, and time for input with respect to E&M process revisions. And that second comment specifically calling attention to the fact that we needed to provide more transparency as well as an opportunity for more engagement and time for input with respect to these changes. And so we do thank all of our commenters for these comments. This is part of the process of improving the E&M policies and procedures. Part of that includes public comment opportunities like we had with the E&M Guidebook recently, as well as the educational webinars that we're having with you all today to disclose any of the changes and obviously giving opportunity through public comment on weighing in on those changes and thus having these educational webinars as such to provide a summary of that and our responses. So this keeps in line with our overall goal of being transparent and also accessible to this information. So going to the next slide, just the other two comments out of that four. One comment we received was just considering changing the name of E&M or this acronym to not be endorsement and maintenance, but to actually be endorsement and management. The reason being is because E&M from this commenter is widely used for evaluation and management of current procedural terminology codes or CPT codes. And the other comment, Patel should consider or reconsider, excuse me, when E&M process changes will take effect as developers need time to address new requirements. So related to that third comment there that's listed, we do thank the commenter for that, and we recognize that there's a lot of acronyms out there in public health and in quality measurement, a lot of acronyms that we see and use, and recognizing that the processes related to evaluation and maintenance and endorsement and maintenance are very different. And actually E&M within quality measurement has been widely known and used for a long time, even prior to when Patel took over the contract. So we will be continuing to use E&M for the purposes of quality measurement. But again, we do thank the commenter for drawing attention to that there's other acronyms out there to be aware of. Regarding the fourth, so for those of you that went through the guidebook and are on the call today and want to know about when these changes might take effect, in the guidebook, we actually had that the changes would impact the fall 2024 cycle. And so for those that are familiar with when that kicks off, that is October 1st of this year. So the submission requirements that we'll outline today, and included in the guidebook, these were something that we stated in the guidebook would take effect for fall 2024 cycle. That is no longer the case. So we appreciate this comment because we want to make sure that we are giving developers and stewards ample time to be able to react and respond to changes. So in this case, we are going to, any of the submission requirement changes that we put out for public comment will not take effect until at least one cycle. So that's 6 months. So instead, the changes that we are outlining today and have proposed in the guidebook as far as the submission requirements, that would be anything related to the rubric and the requirements listed within there, as well as any other submission requirements, would not take effect until spring 2025. So again, giving at least one cycle, which is 6 months, the fall 2024 cycle, to be able to review those requirements, be able to respond to those and react to those accordingly. And we will continue to try to have that type of process moving forward, where we have public comment opportunities happening on submission requirement changes that will not take effect for at least one cycle to give developers and stewards ample time to be able to respond to that. So thank you very much for that comment. I'll turn it over to my colleague, Anna Mickey, who's our Deputy Task Lead, and she'll walk us through some of the other changes to committee structure, et cetera. So Anna, I'll go to next slide and we can take it from there.
Thank you so much, Matt. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. So the guidebook incorporated a few changes related to committee composition, roles, responsibilities, and these changes actually took effect during the spring 2024 cycle. These enhancements were part of the fall 2023 cycle feedback, which we opened for public comments in March and which we actually reviewed during our educational webinar in April. So we are formally incorporating these into the guidebook. And so in summary, the advisory group, the role of the advisory group is to review measures and provide feedback and questions during a separate advisory group meeting, which is held 1 to 2 months prior to the recommendations group meetings. And these inputs really ensure that a larger number of voices contribute to the consensus building process. The recommendations group they review the collective feedback from the advisory group, as well as any public comments or developer steward responses. They provide written comments and ratings on the measures in preparation for the endorsement meetings. And then during those endorsement meetings, they consider all of that collective information, have a discussion, and then render an endorsement decision via a vote. Next slide. So in addition to the committee roles and responsibilities, we also made a couple of changes with respect to committee composition. Again, this is in effect for the spring 2024 cycle and beyond. Specifically, we increased the number of individuals assigned to the recommendations group, which is the voting body, so that there would be a larger number of voices. We now target a total of about 35 to 40 individuals on the advisory group and 20 to 25 individuals on the recommendations group. In addition, as needed, the membership of the recommendations group may be augmented with individuals that have specialized expertise that are recruited from other E&M committees. And this is really driven based on the measures submitted for each cycle and the expertise needed for a particular measure construct. And we also encourage measure developers to invite their own subject matter experts to the meetings if they'd like to speak to any technical or clinical questions or feedback. Next slide. So during the public comment period, we received 3 comments related to the committee composition, roles, and responsibilities changes. First, one comment indicated a need for more visibility around who is serving on the advisory group versus the recommendations group. And we do recognize that this delineation was not previously included within the first E&M roster, and we have aligned our efforts this year with Primer to ensure that there is a standard roster template, which includes these committee group assignments. So if someone's on the advisory group or the recommendations group, as well as their term length. So this new roster format will be used this year with a public comment period for newly seated committee members occurring in July, actually. Next, we heard feedback that the full committee should vote on the measures, not just the recommendations group, to ensure a full range of perspectives are considered. As I mentioned in the prior slide, as part of the changes to the spring 2024 cycle, we did implement those separate meetings with the advisory group to provide a platform for meaningful engagement and to collect input that is foundational to the recommendations group and their endorsement proceedings. And this process follows the evidence-based novel hybrid Delphi nominal group technique, which we use to employ and build consensus. And it's been shown to increase participation and the number of perspectives. So while we will retain the recommendations group as the voting body for the measures, we are confident that a range of perspectives are being considered throughout the process. And finally, we received feedback that Patel should survey committee members for meeting availability to achieve quorum. Planning meetings takes a lot of consideration of material generation, number of meetings, number of measures, and that limits our ability to survey committee members for their availability. However, we have and we will continue to schedule meetings well in advance so that our members can plan their time accordingly and let us know if they're unable to make a meeting. We also have general timeframes posted to our website as to when endorsement meetings occur generally each cycle so that members can plan ahead. So for example, the endorsement meetings for the spring cycle are generally the 4th week of July. And if quorum is not reached or if it's lost during a meeting, we implement a process for collecting offline voting, which involves sharing recordings with members that were not on the call to collect their offline votes. Next slide. So once we receive a full measure submission and measures pass a completeness check, we hold a 30-day public comment period concurrent with staff assessments. And during the spring 2024 cycle, again, in addition to the enhancements related to holding separate advisory group meetings, we implemented an enhancement related to public comment opportunities. And that was hosting public comment listening sessions where members of the public could call in and they could provide a verbal comment on any measure in the spring 2024 cycle. So any of the feedback that we received during the listening session was posted publicly, and then developers and stewards had the opportunity to review those feedback and to provide written responses. And all of those written responses are shared with the committee prior to the endorsement meetings. Next slide. So we received one comment pertaining to public comment opportunities, which requested that Battelle consider the current timelines for public comment as it occurs at the same time as much of the work for primer and MSR. That is the pre-rulemaking measure review and the measure set review activities. We do acknowledge the concern around overlapping public comment periods with primer MSR, and received this feedback from the first round of public comments last year when we sent out the endorsement maintenance guidebook. In response, starting with the spring 2024 cycle, we adjusted E&M's 30-day public comment periods to begin in mid-May for the spring cycle and in mid-November for the fall cycle to really avoid those full overlaps with some of the major primer and MSR activities. So, for example, under the former timeline, the E&M public comment period for the fall cycle was held during the entire month of December, which for primer, the measures under consideration list, or the MUC list, drops on December 1st, and there are a few weeks where the primer committees review and provide written feedback and public comment. So those overlapping activities, to avoid those overlapping activities, we moved the public comment period for E&M to start in mid-November to really lessen the full overlap of these activities. Next slide. So the guidebook incorporated additional detail on the requirements for a measure to be considered for E&M review. And most of these are standard pieces of a complete application. We are simply delineating them more explicitly to help developers ensure their measures are ready for review. And in terms of the requirements, any measure steward that is not a governmental organization must submit a completed quality measure developer and steward agreement, or QMDSA. And this allows Battelle to publicly share information about the measure during the E&M process. In addition, any years of data for the testing, performance gap, trend analyses, stratification, et cetera, must be within the past 5 years to ensure that it's an accurate reflection of clinical practice. The measure must be fully specified and tested for reliability and validity. The measure must specify a responsible entity, which we term the accountable entity, and testing must be conducted for the data sources and level of analysis for which the measure is specified. The intended use of the measure must include an accountability application, for example, public reporting or accreditation purposes or performance-based payment. And finally, the measure submission information must be complete. Next slide. So we also incorporated Appendix G into the guidebook to clarify the CBE's policy on instrument-based clinical quality measures, which are measures that are derived from instruments or surveys. So for example, the CAHPS measures, the Consumer Assessment of Healthcare Providers and Systems measures, those are considered instrument-based clinical quality measures. And this policy states that first, the CBE does not review or endorse the underlying instruments or surveys, but rather we are endorsing the measure that is derived from the instrument or survey. Developers must specify and test instrument-based clinical quality measures at the accountable entity level, and there are no differences in the E&M requirements or criteria for instrument-based measures versus other clinical quality measures. All measures are evaluated based on data element and accountable entity level reliability and validity. For every clinical measure derived from an instrument or survey, we review and endorse them separately. So this means that if an instrument-based measure is derived from 5 questions on a survey, then each of those measures will be reviewed and endorsed separately. Measure developers and stewards are encouraged, where appropriate, to combine individual instrument or survey items into a person respondent level composite, which then may be aggregated to the accountable entity level and reviewed and endorsed as a single measure. And we are working to develop guidance for measure developers on how to operationalize this policy and minimize burden. Next slide. So we received 5 comments about the updates to E&M policies. One comment indicated that endorsement should state the appropriateness of use, for example, if a measure is endorsed for use in public reporting. We do clarify that the purpose of endorsement is not to state whether a measure is appropriate for a specific use, but rather to determine if the measure is safe and effective. So this means that the measure will increase the likelihood of desired health outcomes, will not increase the likelihood of unintended adverse health outcomes, and is consistent with current professional knowledge. So the PQM measure evaluation rubric really sets out to accomplish just that by reviewing the relevance and the importance of the measure, its scientific acceptability, and its current or planned use. But with respect to use, the rubric looks to see if the measure is currently or has a plan for use in an accountability application. And we will continue to consider feedback regarding endorsement for a specific use, but do note that there are other measure review processes, such as the primer process, that review the appropriateness of a measure for use within a specific CMS program. We also heard that Battelle should require annual updates for measures. We do appreciate this suggestion for annual updates to address potentially outdated changes in specifications. However, we emphasize that it's the responsibility of the measure steward to inform Battelle of any specification changes. And this is due to the frequency at which new evidence is generated that would result in a material change to a measure, and it also decreases burden to the developer and steward. Okay. And with that, I will hand it off to Matt to talk about the PQM measure evaluation rubrics.
Great, thank you so much, Anna. And if you have a question, use the Q&A feature that should be located at the bottom of your application on the Zoom application to drop in that Q&A. We'll have a little time at the end of the meeting today to kind of go through those. So as we go through the presentation, if you have a question, use that Q&A feature at the bottom of that Zoom application and drop in your question. So also there's changes that we made to the PQM measure evaluation rubric, like I had mentioned earlier. A summary of those is really further defining what the requirements are for initial endorsement versus maintenance endorsement. And then we also added some requirements specifically around the scientific acceptability domain, which related to reliability and validity. So let's get into those. So let's go to the next slide. So for importance, and sort of going in order here with importance, really for initial endorsement, we are really wanting to see a description that there is some sort of evaluation of other existing measures or programs out there in existence. Again, to think about if this measure is competing with those other measures or other programs, as well as supporting the business case of the measure. So we will be requiring this or expecting this for measures that are submitted for endorsement. And then for maintenance specifically, we want to ensure that there's still a gap that exists with measures. And so we are putting out there that there must be at least moderate certainty that there's evidence of performance gaps. So we have a distribution table that will be required, and there's also additional types of literature to support the performance gap for maintenance measures, but that's going to be required for measure maintenance. Let's go to the next slide. Equity. So for those that are familiar with the rubric and how it is, or at least look at the guidebook and the rubric within it, equity did not come after importance, but keeping in mind the importance of health equity and also trying to reduce disparities across healthcare, we are moving this domain up to coming after importance. But for the fall 2024 cycle, this will still be an optional domain. So we're still doing some information gathering and building out equity guidance to support when it would be required. But right now it's still an optional domain for the fall 2024 cycle. And you'll start to see that in the spring 2025 cycle be right after the importance criterion. So let's go to the next slide. Feasibility. So a couple things here to note for initial and maintenance. So for initial endorsement, developers should be showing that there's evidence that these data elements are generated from routine care delivery, that they're also available in electronic sources, or they will be, there's some sort of a plan to move them into electronic source as well, potentially within 1 year. And also that there's a good data implementation strategy and collection strategy as well. Now for maintenance measures, if the measure specifications have changed in any way, developers and stewards must discuss how those changes have an impact on the data collection, especially if it's different from the routine care delivery, but also if those data or those changes are not available in electronic format, is there a process to eventually move them to that? And that's kind of where that second bullet comes into play, that if there are challenges as well with the implementation of the data or the data elements, we also want to see a mitigation strategy that is outlined for like a 1 year or short-term time frame to overcome any of those challenges due to the implementation of the measure. Going to the next slide. The scientific acceptability. So for initial endorsements, we are going to be requiring that person or encounter level empirical reliability and validity testing be required. Or there's prior empirical evidence that can be used from primary literature to support the data element validity and reliability, or there's a person or encounter level testing. And this should be supporting all of the critical data elements. So that's the data elements that feed the numerator and the denominator and the exclusions of the measure. Now for maintenance, we are requiring that accountable entity level empirical testing be done for reliability and validity. So again, this is at maintenance endorsement. Face validity alone at maintenance is not acceptable or would be inadequate. So face validity is still an acceptable form of validity for a new measure, and this is at the measure score level or the accountable entity level. But if it is submitted only for the maintenance measure for endorsement, that is not sufficient. We want to see that this empirical testing for reliability and validity is performed for when the measure comes back through for maintenance. Okay, let's go to the next slide. For use and usability, we just built out the current and planned uses, as you can see listed here, really aligning with what is also within merits, so public reporting, the public health and disease surveillance, payment programs, et cetera. So just really specifying those types of use cases. And then going to the next slide, we also provide a little bit of more detail about what an accountability application is. So this requirement under use and usability, especially for initial endorsement, we want to see that there is a plan for use in at least one accountability application. That accountability application can include confidential reporting. It can include some sort of a program where there's a reward or recognition or even penalty that either payment may be tied to it or some sort of a selection type of program. So there's different types of accountability, but we also want to see that there's a plan, at least for initial endorsement, on using that measure if it's not currently used in at least one accountability application. And for maintenance, if the measure is not currently in use in at least one accountability application, we want to see that there's a short-term plan, at least within 1 year, that has been described from the developer. Going to the next slide. So we received 9 comments related to the PQM rubric, and so we'll kind of break them down here as we go through these slides. The first 2 were around considering that the ECQM or electronic clinical quality measure requirements. Since the measure authoring tool, or the MAT, is no longer available after June 24th, is to revise the ECQM requirements to account for that, as well as we should clarify whether data element validity for ECQMs is required for all critical data elements or all data elements. And so we thank the commenters for these suggestions. We have updated the guidance and we'll be updating the measure submission forms to remove that required MAT file description, as again, that measure authoring tool is not available after June 24th. And also we've clarified that the ECQM testing should be for all critical data elements, so that numerator, denominator, and also the exclusions, especially if it's something that's within unstructured fields. Go to the next slide. We received comments here about requiring reclassification error for testing, or reclassification error testing, especially for measures that are used in public reporting. And we also had feedback to say that we should be consistent on using the terms person or encounter level reliability or validity versus data element reliability, validity, and aligning where we can with the CMS blueprint. And we thank the commenters for these suggestions. We will consider the reclassification error testing by working with the scientific methods panel to see how this requirement may support some of the current endorsement proceedings and the rubric. So we definitely welcome those types of suggestions as we engage the scientific methods panel around that. So that will be taken into consideration. As well as being consistent throughout the guidebook, drawing attention that the patient or encounter level testing is an actual level within the submission form. So we are using that within the guidance and then just calling attention to it in parentheses that this is meaning an inclusive of data element validity testing. And we'll continue to align where we can with the CMS blueprint. We work closely to review that document as well. So we will continue to align with terms that are used within that blueprint as well. Next slide. Other two comments here for 5 and 6. So we should consider aligning fields and definitions with merit, which is that measures under consideration for looking at CMS programs and including in CMS programs. And also the need to add a guidance around how continuous measures or measures that use continuous variables are to be considered, since the commenter mentioned that they did not fall within the traditional numerator-denominator type of classification. So we appreciate the suggestion, definitely around aligning with merit. We have and will continue to do this if and when appropriate to reduce burden to developers who are submitting to E&M as well as to the MUC list. And regarding the continuous variable measures, so really the intent and what we'll try to continue to clarify, especially for those measures, is that the intent of that denominator would be to capture that target population or potentially services that may be trying to be measured. And while the numerator is really meant to describe that measure focus. So even though that some of these continuous variables may not fall within a typical numerator-denominator description, we will still keep those fields and provide more clarification on how to address those with a continuous variable type of measures. Going to the next slide. So a couple more of our comments that were received here. So need to clarify the meaning of the deciles. So we have decile tables for both performance gap, but also for accountable entity level reliability testing. So there was a request to really clarify the deciles of reliability scores across providers or deciles for provider volume. And then for the maintenance of endorsement, will there be an exception for face validity if there's justification to be considered by the committee, and also the recommendation to set a threshold of agreement for face validity to be at least 60% or greater. So regarding the decile tables, we will and have made those updates to those tables to note that for performance gap, the deciles would be by performance score, and then for the accountable entity reliability table, that will be deciles by denominator target population size. For the face validity, this is a great comment and question, but since we have lengthened the maintenance review time period to 5 years, plus we give the opportunity for developers or stewards to defer up to 2 consecutive cycles, which is another year. So 6 years total that a developer may use by the time the measure needs to come back in for maintenance. We feel that this should provide sufficient time for developers and stewards to conduct some empirical analyses at the accountable entity level for those requirements that I mentioned previously. Therefore, there won't be an exception for face validity and that justification at maintenance due to the increased timeframes that I just referred to. We also thank you for the comment on the 60% threshold and agree that there needs to be more structure around the face validity expectation, also something that we'll be engaging our S&P around as well. So we won't be moving forward with a 60% or any threshold at this time, but we will keep this in mind, and we do really thank the commenter for that suggestion. Let's go to the next slide. So the last comment we had here on the rubric was that Patel should consider requiring a distribution of measure scores, both for initial endorsement and maintenance. So currently, that distribution of measure scores for performance gap is required for maintenance measures. So we do recognize that developers may have data when they're submitting their measure for initial endorsement, and they can provide a distribution of measure scores with those data. Some developers may not, or may not have sufficient data to do so. So we have updated the form so that it is optional for new measures. So if a developer has data and they want to populate the distribution table for initial endorsement, they are able to do so, but it's not required. It still is required for maintenance endorsement. So it is an optional now for initial endorsement. Let's go to the next slide, which is another area that we did some enhancements to, which was the endorsement conditions and the designations. We did add this table within the guidebook, which gives a little bit more specificity and description to some of the types of conditions and some examples where these conditions could apply. I think the important message here is that these conditions aren't something to where it's not a non-negotiable. And so, like if the measure lacks a business case, or the testing does not align with the specifications or the level of accountability, that is not a condition we place on the measure. Those are non-negotiables. Those are things we want to see and expect to see. Rather, these conditions are things to where maybe there's additional work or additional types of clarification or even engagement that the developer steward should do with some of the accountable entities to better support some of these elements like feasibility or implementation, et cetera. So you can see some of these conditions here by some of the domains of the rubric. The thing around importance, right? If there's not a lot of that patient input that's been captured, or maybe there's just a very small amount of this, there could be a condition placed to sort of expand that out and maybe do some additional types of literature reviews, or even thinking about engaging patients through focus groups, et cetera, to gain some input on this. This also helps to think about the logic model and the business case for the measure. Patient input could actually help to advise the face validity of the measure and the logic model itself. So that's the type of condition that could be placed on a measure here for importance, as well as expanding performance gap testing to a larger population. If there is some performance gap testing done, there may be a consideration to actually expand that to a larger population to continue to consider whether or not a gap really does exist. You can see for reliability, there's a consideration here to implement some mitigation strategies or approaches. Now, this is not to say it's reliability if a large percentage of the accountable entities have low reliability. This is not something that we would put a condition on, but maybe for like a 30% of the accountable entities have a lower reliability at the accountable entity level, there may be some mitigation approaches that we can work with the developer on here at Patel to try to improve the reliability estimates for those lower performing providers. So it is a condition. It means the measure can still be endorsed given the fact that a large majority of the accountable entities actually meet the expected value for reliability, but maybe there's something we could do for the smaller amount of accountable entities. And for feasibility, it's providing implementation guidance. If there's any challenges with implementing the measure or any questions around how the measure might be implemented, there's potentially some implementation guidance that the committee may want to see as part of the condition for the measure. And with use and usability, if there's a lack of really a strong feedback mechanism, or really not sure why the measure is not moving the needle anymore, it's not, there's in your trend analysis, maybe why is it not moving? We may have a condition to try to engage those accountable entities or try to see if there's ways to improve that feedback mechanism for the next time the measure comes back through for endorsement. So these are some conditions and some of the examples listed over there on the right to help support some of those also. Let's go to the next slide. So we did receive a couple comments here, just noting that the committee should not endorse measures without conditions explicitly stated and defined, and the need for greater clarity regarding the time frame for these conditions, and actually suggesting that maybe there should be a tiered approach to assigning conditions, because not every condition is the same. So thinking that maybe like one condition would be a year, another one would be 2 years, that sort of tiered approach is what the commenter was getting at. And we thank the commenters for these. And we do and have made sure to identify conditions that are going to be placed on the measure prior to when the committee votes. Like I said, we will be continuing to do that. So through the conversations that happen during these endorsement meetings, prior to when the committee votes, we will make sure to clearly define the conditions and make sure the committee understands what that means for when they're voting on endorsement with conditions. Part of that too is considering the time frame that would make sense for the condition. So we recognize that not all conditions are the same. That's correct. But the feasibility and resources that developers have also are not necessarily the same. So rather than assigning a certain time frame, we really want to try to still keep this open and make sure that in discussing with the developer during these endorsement meetings, what may be feasible, whether it's something that needs to be something within a 3-year time frame as opposed to a 5-year time frame. So we will continue to explore and consider a tiered approach if that does seem to be a better approach or alternative. For right now, we're still being flexible with this, recognizing that developers and stewards may not have all the resources needed to achieve a certain time frame for a condition. Let's go to the next slide, and I will turn it back to Anna to finish up with the last enhancement.
Sure, thanks, Matt. So the guidebook also incorporated some additional detail for appeals eligibility. So after the endorsement meetings, there is an appeals period where an interested party can submit an appeal for a measure. And when an appeal is received, Battelle conducts a preliminary review of that appeal to determine its eligibility. So if an appeal of a measure that was endorsed or endorsed with conditions is received, it must cite specific evidence, and it must be based on one of three rationales. So first, that evidence exists that was available by the cycle's intent to submit deadline, but was not considered by the E&M committee at the time of the endorsement decision and is likely to affect the outcome of the endorsement decision. Two, that the CBE's measure evaluation criteria was not applied appropriately, of course, citing the specific evaluation criteria that they believe was misapplied and why. And the third rationale could be that the CBE executed a procedural error, meaning that the E&M process was not followed. And so, of course, specifying the error in the process step, how that was misapplied or not followed properly, and how this resulted in the measure being endorsed. So one of those three rationales. And then for an appeal of a measure that was not endorsed, or if endorsement was removed, they must be based on one of two rationales. So either the measure evaluation criteria was not applied appropriately, as I mentioned above, or the CBE executed a procedural error, which I also reviewed. Okay, next slide. So finally, the guidebook includes a few clarifications on the endorsement maintenance process and policies. So measures are evaluated for maintenance every 5 years, and developers have the option to submit an annual update of the measure specification to Battelle. So if changes occur to a measure at any time in between the measure's last endorsement review and its 5-year scheduled maintenance of endorsement date, the measure steward is responsible for informing Battelle immediately by submitting a status report. So Battelle will then review that information and determine if it necessitates an early maintenance review, for example, due to evidence of unintended consequences or material changes to the measure specifications. And Battelle offers technical assistance and education to developers throughout the maintenance process. So if you have questions, please reach out. And finally, we include in our measure deferment policy in the updated guidebook. So measure stewards may request an extension of up to 1 year or 2 cycles for measure maintenance, except if it has been more than 6 years since the measure was last reviewed. So that measure deferment policy is now listed in the guidebook. Next slide. So we received one comment on appeals and maintenance requirements. First, we heard that Battelle should note any deferrals or extension in the submission tool and repository in the STAR tool. We appreciate the suggestion, and we will consider it as a future enhancement to STAR, so thank you. We also received a question, which was, is the expansion of a measure's level of analysis considered to be the same measure that is to be assessed as part of maintenance review and not as a new measure submission? And the answer to that question is yes, that the measure would be submitted under the same CBE ID if it had an expanded level of analysis. And we'll be sure to clarify this in the rubric and under what constitutes a material change in the guidebook. Next slide. Okay, so going forth to next steps, I think we can move on to slide 35. So in terms of next steps, the final E&M guidebook will be available and posted to the PQM website by July 31st. Our spring endorsement meetings are also almost here. They're scheduled for the end of July, starting with primary prevention on July 26th and ending with cost and efficiency on August the 1st. And then finally, looking ahead to the fall 2024 cycle, just a gentle reminder that the intent to submit deadline is October the 1st, and the full measure submission deadline is November the 1st. Next slide. And as a reminder, we encourage everyone to sign up to become a PQM member so that you can stay updated on PQM activities and events. Membership is free and can be submitted at the individual or the organizational level. Members receive regular notifications about opportunities to get involved, such as committee nominations and open calls for public comment. And you can follow the link on the slides here to join if you have not already. All right, and with that, I will pass it off to Quinn. I think there might be some questions that you received, and we'll open the question and answer session.
Yes, thank you so much, Anna. So we do have a number of questions. Thank you so much. Please keep your questions coming in. We have a little bit under 15 minutes, so we have a little bit of time. Matt, I'll start with the first question for you. For measures which have undergone multiple maintenance cycles, if empirical validity has been provided in previous maintenance cycles, does new information have to be provided in subsequent maintenance cycles?
So I guess I'm not sure the new information, but updated information. So we are looking to see that there is some updated testing or updated type of performance gap information with respect to having the most recent data within the last 5 years. This is due to the fact that processes change, data change, or data get updated. So we want to see that there is some sort of an update for when those measures come back through. And again, that's at every 5 years. So just updating the performance gap information with most recent data, and even considering testing as well.
Thank you, Matt. And Anna, I have a question for you. For feasibility testing of an ECQM, will different standards such as Fire QI Core versus QDM data elements be considered, such as in the scorecard?
Thanks, Gwen. It's a great question, and I'll welcome Matt's input as well. But we are considering the changes that might be needed to our materials based on the fire transition. So in the most recent guidebook, as Matt mentioned, we are removing the mention of the measure authoring tool as that has been sunsetted. There will also be a couple of additions in there with respect to fire and QDM, but in terms of the ECQM feasibility scorecard, I think that is still TBD. Matt, anything in additional?
Yes, and that's correct. And we're also working with, obviously, keeping in line with what's going on with merit and the MUC submission process as well. So making sure that we're aligning with what requirements or what types of questions may be asked related to any of the measures that are fire enabled. And that's reflected within E&M. So coming back to that comment around ensuring that we're aligning with merit, we are doing that, especially when we're considering fire. So there will be some mention of this within the guidebook, but as far as a scorecard and things of that nature, it's still a TBD as we're working together with merit to make sure that we're aligned on what we're expecting from submissions.
Thank you both. Matt, I have two questions I think that are very similar, so I'm going to give them both to you at the same time. The first one is, when will the new changes take effect? And then the second one, I think, is just asking about, it sounds as if you're not making any changes in response to comments you received most recently. So if you could answer those two together, that would be great.
Sure. So we are making changes. Some of the changes we noted, we already did make for spring 2024, and that was really in response to the feedback we received from fall 2023, the most recent cycle and the first cycle that we kicked this process off. Those changes were largely around, like I said, committee engagement and making sure that we're creating a space to collect advisory group input, as well as ensuring that we still have a strong representation on the recommendation group by increasing their size, as well as offering additional public comment opportunities. So we did make those changes in response to feedback that we received from the fall 2023 cycle. And even with this round, we are making changes and corrections to the guidebook, as we've stated throughout the presentation today, related to some of the clarifications on ECQMs or testing terminology. And there are some of these suggestions from the commenters around reclassification error, face validity testing. We do recognize that there needs to be some exploration into that. And so we want to work with our scientific methods panel related to that. So with the changes that we've outlined related to the PQM measure submission rubric, as well as some of these submission requirements, like we mentioned, those are going to take effect spring 2025, for the spring 2025 cycle. The other changes that we've already implemented are already in effect, and we'll be moving forward going into the fall 2024 cycle and beyond, unless we also need to reevaluate those and make changes accordingly there as well. We will continue to use a structure to where we are pushing out changes through our guidebook and public comment, and any of those measure submission requirements that impact developers and their ability to submit measures to us, would not take effect for at least one cycle. So again, that would be the spring 2025 cycle for these submission changes, and appreciate that comment and question.
Thank you. And the next question is for you, Matt. It's a little bit of a clarification. To clarify the question on multiple maintenance cycles and empirical validity requirements, robust empirical validity testing is burdensome to developers in terms of study design, data acquisition, analysis, etc. Does empirical validity testing need to be redone for each 5-year maintenance cycle?
If there are significant changes to the measure specifications or changes that have been done to the measure specifications, yes. We are wanting to see that there is some sort of exploration into that. And again, keeping in mind, if there are changes in practice, changes in care delivery that would require the measure to be updated with most recent data within the past 5 years, that is really what we're wanting to see here. We also want to consider that just because it was tested and reliable 10 years ago, it doesn't mean it may necessarily, it may need to be updated and more recent data needs to be submitted. So that's what this consideration is getting at. So the short answer to that is yes. However, if the developer is really thinking that there's no really strong change to the specifications or significant change in specifications that doesn't require the testing to be updated, please submit that in your submission. But we are really trying to incentivize through these considerations of endorsement that more recent data are included in these measure submissions so that the committee understands and has a little bit more relevance to the actual submission that they're reviewing.
Thank you, Matt. And then why is the equity criterion still optional, and when will it be required?
Anna, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So for the equity criteria, it is still optional, as you noted. However, we are looking ahead and planning for it to become a required domain, likely sometime around the spring 2025 cycle. We are currently in the process of drafting guidance this year on how developers can address the equity domain in preparation for eventually making it a required domain. But we do recognize that there is a need for guidance around considering feasibility challenges with data and methods, et cetera. So we are spending time to put forth the guidance in preparation for making it a required domain going into spring 2025.
Thank you, Anna. One more question for you. How are stakeholders notified about public comment opportunities?
Sure. So as I mentioned, please become a PQM member if you haven't already. This is a great tool for you to have, to receive notifications about opportunities to get involved. So we do alert stakeholders about current or upcoming public comment opportunities through various communication channels, including notifying PQM members via email, also including announcements in our monthly newsletters, listing upcoming opportunities in our meeting slides, as I just mentioned with our next steps. We include quarterly webinar slides, kind of if there's any open public comment opportunities as a plug. And then we also have a public comments ribbon on our PQM website where you can go to and look for any open public comment opportunities that are active at that time. So I think that's pretty much it.
All right, thank you so much. Matt, back to you with a question. Could you please clarify once again how the underlining tool will be evaluated when PQM is considering measures based on tools such as the CAPS items?
Great question. So yes, again, we're not endorsing a tool or a survey or an instrument that may be used to inform the measure or used within the measure. That's not what the endorsement bodies are doing or what this process is intended to do. Rather, it's that being aggregated to some sort of accountable entity level and endorsing that measure as such. However, we recognize that developers use tools, and so it would be up to the developer to try to inform the committee that the tool is a valid and reliable tool, whether that be from literature or prior work that they've done. But ultimately, we're looking at the endorsed measure itself, or the measure itself that rolled up data to the accountable entity level, and looking at whether there are reliability and validity considerations there. So it really would, the developer should provide that, or should argue and claim that the tool itself or the survey being used is reliable and valid through literature or other work that's been done. But for the purposes of endorsement, we're looking at how that is rolled up to an accountable entity and reviewing that aspect of the measure for endorsement.
All right, thank you so much, Matt. Anna, I'll pass it back to you for the next question. Why might a measure be deferred, and how can stewards or developers request a measure deferral?
Thanks, Quinn. So just to restate the deferral policy, so measure stewards may request an extension of up to 1 year or 2 cycles for measure maintenance, except if it's been more than 6 years since that measure was last reviewed. So developers might request a deferral, for example, due to availability of implementation data or a delay in implementing the measure into an accountability program. So during measure maintenance, the measure must be in use in at least one accountability application. And in addition, during measure maintenance, developers must also provide evidence of a performance gap and information on performance scores to show if the measure can be used to improve performance among those measured entities. So developers may wish to request a deferral to allow additional time for data collection and measure implementation. And in terms of the process, it's quite simple. So the developer or steward would just send a ticket to pqmsupport@battelle.org, just letting us know the measure name, the measure number, a very brief rationale for the deferral, and the specific cycle that you are seeking. And then we would review the measure for deferral eligibility.
Thank you. So we're in our last 3 minutes, and I think we have one final question. Thank you guys so much for all of your questions. So Matt, I'm going to bounce this one back to you. What are the expectations of developers and stewards with respect to the added committee meetings, i.e. public comment listening session and advisory group meetings, as well as the upcoming endorsement meetings?
Yeah, it's a great question. So for developers and stewards, we now have these public comment listening sessions and advisory group meetings plus the endorsement meetings. For the public comment listening sessions, that's exactly what they are. It's to listen to any of the public comments that have come through during that live meeting. And so there's no expectation for you as a developer or steward to respond to those comments during the meeting, during that public comment listening session. It really is to listen to those comments. And we will post those comments, the transcripts from those comments, to the public comment page on the actual measure page itself as well for full visibility to not just developers and stewards, but also the public. The advisor group meetings, we do invite and encourage developers to attend those calls, as this is an opportunity for the advisor group members to also ask questions and give feedback about the measures under review. And we hope that developers will attend those to answer those questions of the advisor group members. Even if developers cannot answer a question on those calls from the advisor group, we give an opportunity to provide written response after those meetings. So there will be an opportunity again to either clarify responses that were shared or also address questions that you weren't able to answer during those advisor group meetings. For the recommendation group meeting, which we have those coming up here at the end of the month, expectation here is also we encourage developers to attend those calls. The expectation during those calls is developers can provide an overview and additional commentary about the measure during designated points of the review, as well as be there to answer questions as needed if the recommendation group members really need the developer to answer any questions. We will be trying to keep the conversations focused within the recommendation group for those meetings, but if a question does come up, we will go to the developer to answer those questions. And there will be an opportunity prior to the endorsement vote for the developer to provide any additional feedback or responses to the discussion that is held by the recommendation group. For both of these meetings, advisor group and recommendation group, we also recommend and invite developers to invite their subject matter experts if they work with any subject matter experts on the design of their measure or testing of their measure. We invite you to have them in attendance as well, to also be a representative from the developer and could answer questions as they do come up from either recommendation group members or advisor group members. So we do encourage that. We will be emailing developers out asking for those representatives and a list of those names. And we ask that you share those with us so that way we can ensure that they are getting the right link to join as a panelist so they can freely come off mute accordingly. So great question. Thank you.
All right, we are at time, Matt. We do have one more question, but we will try to include that in our summary. Is that correct?
Yes, sure, yes. Okay. Well, it's 3 o'clock. Appreciate everyone's attention today. Thank you for joining. And thank you again for all those commenters that submitted comments. Look forward to working with you as we close out this current cycle and moving into the fall 2024 cycle. So thank you all very much. Have a great rest of your day and a great weekend.